When we think of the word psychopath, we often picture emotionless murderers from horror movies. While these images might make for great stories to tell by a campfire, back in the 18th century, there was no concept of psychopathy as we know it now. Those who behave immorally aren't diagnosed, they're feared and condemned. Today on Sketchy Toons, we will be seeing the horrifying ways psychopaths were diagnosed in the 18th century. London, 1750. The air reeks with smoke from the coal fires. The cobblestones glisten with the sheen of recent rain, echoing with the clatter of carriage wheels and the sharp cries of street vendors. Gas lamps burn dimly, barely pushing back the enveloping darkness. It is a city packed with contradictions, booming trade and deep poverty, scientific awakening and unwavering superstition, refined manners and raw brutality. This isn't the London of the Romantic poets. This is the London of panic, of spectacle, of punishment. A place where severe, inexplicable behavior isn't diagnosed, it's feared. Explained not by medicine, but by morality. Not by science, but by sin. In the absence of psychiatric terminology, people who deviated from accepted social norms were labeled as wicked, possessed, or inherently evil. Sometimes their behaviors were seen as divine punishment, other times as the result of poor upbringing, sinful living, or demonic influence. There was no distinction between criminality and mental illness. The emerging world of medical science had yet to explore the complexities of the mind, and this worldview saw morality and mental soundness as one and the same. But even within this harsh setting, flickers of understanding were beginning to emerge. To understand how those we might now call psychopaths were viewed in the 18th century, we must first understand how society responded to nonconformity in general. 18th century London was a city in constant change. With the growth of urbanization and the early indications of the Industrial Revolution, traditional social structures were breaking down. As a result, anxieties about crime, immorality, and disorder ran rampant. Print media exploded in this period. Pamphlets, broadsides, newspapers, and satirical engravings by artists like William Hogarth and James Gilray flooded the public sphere, creating a network of communication capable of amplifying fear. Dramatic stories of the battles between vices and virtues were consumed with morbid fascination. In this crucible, the concept of a moral panic was born. Sociologists today use the term moral panic to describe a societal reaction that labels certain people as threats to moral order. Odd behavior wasn't just simply odd behavior. It was a perceived threat to the moral order of society. Being mad wasn't merely a health condition. It was a moral failing. The term madness was an umbrella for everything. Eccentricity, epilepsy, melancholy, obsession, depression, mania, and violence. Those who disobeyed the limits of social acceptability were bundled into a single, terrifying category. And when there was no agenda to tell the difference between neurological disorder and deliberate cruelty, a dangerous assumption emerged. If someone was violent, it was because they chose to be. If they harmed others, it must be because they wanted to. The 18th century was a period of transition in how madness was understood. On one hand, Enlightenment thinkers began to push for more experimental and medically focused approaches to mental illness. However, centuries of religious thinking still loomed. In many people's eyes, madness was seen as a failure of morals and faith. When someone committed violent or irrational acts, the question was not, what illness does this person have? But instead, what sin have they committed? Or what evil possesses them? Explanations for deviant behavior included demonic possession, divine punishment, or an inherently corrupt nature. Without a scientific framework to understand psychopathy, early modern Europe turned to the oldest explanation of all: biblical evil. Abnormality, especially when it involved cruelty or violence without apparent reason, was often interpreted as a form of the devil entering the hearts and minds of men and women, driving them to sin. The church became a key site of interpretation. Clergy warned of the dangers of godlessness, of moral decay. They described the morally deranged as being infected by an intrinsic canker, a corrupting force that could rob someone of their senses and their humanity. This language, graphic and emotive, served to both fearmonger society and to dehumanize the offenders, making punishment not just justified, but necessary. Mental illness, where recognized, was often dealt with through confinement, isolation, or punishment. Hogarth's A Rake's Progress depicts the final descent of a wayward aristocrat into madness, with the final panel showing him shackled in an asylum. The imagery is clear. Madness is a kind of hell, reserved for those who don't conform or simply don't fit in with social norms. Punishment and spiritual remedy were often one and the same. Communication with God, fasting, and exorcism were as likely to be recommended as bleeding or purging. The idea that emotions and moral decisions could be physically diseased had not yet taken hold in medical circles. Women especially were vulnerable to accusations of moral madness. Diagnoses like hysteria, from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus, were broad terms for behaviors deemed inappropriate, rebellious, or overtly sexual. A woman who defied her husband or acted with boldness might be labeled mad or even institutionalized. It is in this overlap of sin, crime, and madness that we find the precursors to psychopathy. People who appeared unaffected by guilt, who caused harm without remorse, who lived by manipulation or cruelty. And they were punished, not treated, feared, not understood. In court, these people were nightmares, not just in what they had done, but in how they behaved. They seemed composed, polite, even charismatic. And that in itself was terrifying, because it made the crime feel calculated, cold. It wasn't a moment of madness, it was methodical. Juries weren't just judging actions anymore. They were judging absence. Absence of remorse. Absence of motive. Absence of humanity. Perhaps the most chilling thing about these madmen was not their rage. It was their calm. It's easier to process violence when it comes in a frenzy, when a person is yelling, sobbing, or shaking. Those feelings are understandable. But many of these individuals didn't seem to feel, at least not in the ways people expected. No sorrow, no regret, no fear. This disturbed the public more than any crime ever could. Because if a person could kill and smile, if they could confess without sweating, sleep before they're hanging, eat a full dinner the night before death, then where did that leave our assumptions about guilt and punishment? How do you make someone atone when they don't feel sorry? How do you frighten someone who doesn't feel fear? Enter the idea of the folk devil, a figure of fear created and inflated by public hysteria. These were people who violated the social contract in ways so extreme or confusing they became mythic, inhuman, demonic. The public responded to them not with pity, but with panic. Stories of inexplicable violence, especially when committed by someone who didn't seem mad in the traditional sense, led to moral frenzy. Gossip and scandal filled the void where scientific explanation was missing. If the courts judged the crime, the press judged the soul. The media of the 18th century fed London's appetite for horror, and monsters made great copy. They muttered of gangs like the Mohawks. This gang of aristocratic young men supposedly roamed the streets of London attacking random citizens. Accounts described them slashing faces, overturning women in barrels, and inventing cruel games of torture. The fear surrounding the Mohawks was immense, though some historians argue their existence may have been exaggerated by the press. Either way, their legend became a way to express concerns about youthful rebellion, declining aristocratic morals, and lawlessness. Then came Madame Geneva. Not a woman, but a nickname for cheap gin. Gin, cheap and potent, became the drug of the urban poor. Madame Geneva was the personification of this intoxicant, often depicted in caricatures as a skeletal, wretched woman luring citizens into ruin. The gin craze led to moral panic about public drunkenness, crime, and the collapse of family life. Those addicted to gin were not seen as ill, but as morally degenerate. In retrospect, the chaotic behavior of some individuals may have stemmed from mental illness or psychological distress, but at the time, it was all explained through the lens of moral weakness. And finally, the London Monster. By the 1790s, another panic was sweeping the streets of London. This time, the terror was not a group, but a single individual, the so-called London Monster. Between 1788 and 1790, over 50 women came forward claiming they had been attacked by a mysterious man who stalked them, shouting obscenities, and, in many cases, stabbed them in the buttocks with sharp instruments. The attacks triggered widespread hysteria. Women took to the streets with pins sewn into their skirts for protection. Men were wrongfully accused, beaten, and even arrested. Public meetings were held. The press was relentless. A reward of £100 was offered for the capture of the monster, a huge sum at the time. Eventually, a man named Renwick Williams was apprehended, tried, and convicted, though many historians now doubt his guilt. Regardless of his innocence, the reaction to the monster case reveals much about how 18th century society processed acts of bizarre, unprovoked aggression. The London Monster was more than a criminal. He was a symbol of chaos, of perversion without motive. His behavior defied rational explanation, and in the absence of psychological insight, he was treated as a kind of urban demon, an embodiment of everything that was feared but not understood. Again, we see the familiar hallmarks of psychopathy: stalking, targeting the vulnerable, showing no clear motive or remorse. But once again, these behaviors were not medicalized. Instead, they were moralized and sensationalized. The media did not explore why someone might commit such acts. It merely amplified the horror, fed the panic, and demanded justice. The monster, whether real or imagined, served as a conduit for broader anxieties about gender, class, and the fragility of public order. This was moral panic at its peak, and the London Monster was the model folk devil. Each headline shaped public fear. That evil wasn't just external, it walked among them, unfeeling. Worse, it might not even look mad. The criminal became a spectacle. The punishment became a public performance. Rather than attempt to understand what led someone to commit harm, society focused on purging the evil they believed lived within that person. There's something deeply unsettling about what we can't explain. Without the tools of psychology, people tried to name what they saw using the only vocabulary they had. They called them monsters, devils, villains. But each label said more about us than them. About our need to put the unthinkable in a box, to create distance, to call it evil, so we don't have to imagine it could ever live in someone like us. So, enter the idea of hospitalization. If you were deemed mad in 18th century London, there was one place everyone feared more than the gallows: Bedlam. Officially, it was Bethlem Royal Hospital, London's most infamous asylum. Unofficially, it was akin to an evening at the theater. The poor, the criminal, and the misunderstood were locked away behind its thick stone walls, often without trial. They were called maniacs, lunatics, and wild beasts. But the public didn't just ignore them. They watched them. Visitors paid admission, literally to gawk at patients at Bedlam's infamous viewing galleries. Men and women, often shackled, humiliated, starved, and whipped, were displayed like animals in a human zoo. It was madness as entertainment. No one knew exactly what made someone a psychopath, but if they were inconvenient, unfeeling, or unruly, Bedlam would take care of it. The asylum thus played a dual role. On one hand, it was a symbol of progress, an attempt to understand and manage madness. On the other hand, it remained a repository for the unwanted, the untreatable, the terrifying. It is in these spaces, half prison, half hospital, that the modern concept of the psychopath slowly emerged. Institutions like Bedlam played a central role in housing individuals with what we'd now consider schizophrenia or severe mania. But there were also inmates who exhibited violent or emotionally cold behavior, and who lacked clear signs of delusion or intellectual impairment. Doctors, or more accurately, mad doctors, as they were then called, took detailed notes on these individuals. Their methods were rudimentary, observational, and deeply subjective. Patients were categorized based on how they behaved in confined settings. Did they scream? Did they show remorse? Did they attack orderlies or manipulate fellow patients? There were no diagnostic categories akin to psychopathy, but there was growing awareness that some individuals exhibited madness not of the mind, but of the morals. These cases baffled physicians, people who seemed completely lucid and articulate, yet incapable of emotional connection or guilt. This confusion laid the groundwork for later ideas like moral insanity. But in the 18th century, such individuals were often deemed incurable. Treatment typically consisted of restraint, isolation, or public display, or experimentation which bordered on torture. Those we might now see as psychopathic were often interpreted as evidence of evil incarnate, and they became examples of what happened when a person's soul had rotted away. Although the medical establishment had no basis for diagnosing psychopathy, they did attempt to treat various forms of madness through physical experimentation. These treatments were mostly applied to the mad in general. Those showing antisocial or remorseless behavior were sometimes subjected to them. These included bloodletting, believed to balance the bodily fluids, particularly when a person was thought to be overtaken by black bile, associated with melancholy and madness. Blistering and purging, applying caustic substances to the skin to create blisters, or inducing vomiting and diarrhea to purge the body of perceived toxins. Cold water therapy, dunking patients in cold water or spraying them with jets from a pump, sometimes as a form of shock treatment. Spinning chairs and rotational therapy. Some doctors believed that rotating patients at high speeds in specially designed chairs would disorient the brain and reset it, an early, brutal form of sensory manipulation. There were also moral treatments, forcing patients to confess, to pray, to weep. If they didn't cry, that alone was seen as proof of evil. None of these treatments were targeted at what we would now call psychopathy, but individuals with unemotional, violent behavior were subjected to them, particularly when they resisted authority or defied expectations of repentance. In some cases, autopsies were performed after death in an attempt to find physical evidence of madness. Physicians sought abnormalities in the brain, skull, or other organs. If a notorious criminal or inmate had behaved in an especially inhuman way, their remains might be studied, their skull measured, or their body dissected to find a cause. There were no MRIs, no personality assessments, no clinical tests. Diagnosis was mostly guesswork, and the guesses were often cruel. It actually wasn't until the 1830s that a more nuanced framework began to emerge. A British physician named J.C. Pritchard introduced a radical new concept: moral insanity. For the first time, someone proposed that a person could be mentally ill, not because their intellect was damaged, but because their emotions and moral faculties were. According to Pritchard, moral insanity was a state in which the moral and active principles of the mind are strongly perverted or depraved. The power of self-government is lost or greatly impaired. These individuals were not necessarily delusional or intellectually impaired. They could be coherent, articulate, even charming. But their actions were erratic, cruel, and socially destructive. In today's terms, this sounds very much like what we would call psychopathy. Pritchard was describing individuals who could function in society but who showed no regard for its rules or values. And crucially, he did not see this as a spiritual failing. He saw it as a medical condition, a disorder of the emotional system. His ideas were influenced by German Romantic medicine, particularly the Naas school, which emphasized the holistic interplay between body and soul. Madness, they believed, could arise from the visceral organs, not just the brain. Emotions, they argued, were seated in the bodily humors. A disordered liver, stomach, or heart could lead to a disordered mind. This approach blurred the lines between physical and mental illness, and for a long time, it allowed physicians to consider deviance without invoking sin or possession. But it opened the door to new forms of medical control. If moral insanity was a disease, then those who suffered from it could be kept safe, not for what they had done, but for what they might do. Predictive medicine in its earliest form. Pritchard's work was the beginning of the transition from moral panic to medical diagnosis. It might not have ended cruelty, but it did change its justification. And it paved the way for later theories of psychopathy rooted in neurology, heredity, and brain function. So, how were the psychopaths diagnosed in the 18th century? The short answer is that they weren't, at least not in the way we understand diagnosis today. But they were named, punished, observed, and speculated about through institutional observation, bodily experimentation, and relentless media coverage. 18th century society attempted to make sense of individuals who lived without conscience. In doing so, they laid a foundation, flawed, fearful, and fascinating, for the medical and moral outlines that would follow. As of today, it seems that we're still grappling with the same questions. What causes someone to lose all empathy? How do we distinguish between mental illness and malicious intent? What should society do with those who cannot or will not abide by its moral codes? In tracing the horrifying ways psychopaths were understood and treated in the 18th century and beyond, we do more than explore a medical history. We find a mirror, reflecting our deepest fears, our evolving morals, and our endless struggle to understand a level of darkness within ourselves.